I remember the silence before it happened, the kind of silence that only exists when machines run out of breath. The Tiger's engine coughed once, twice, and then stopped with a deep mechanical sigh, like a dying beast exhaling one last time. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The air outside was thick with cold, and the fog of the Ardennes swallowed the sound of everything, even war. It was December 17th, 1944, 5:30 hours. Honsfeld, Belgium. I can still feel the crunch of frost beneath my boots when I climbed down from the command tank. The iron of the hatch was freezing under my gloves. Around me, 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, nearly 5,000 of our best Waffen-SS men, the most powerful armored spearhead we'd ever assembled, all stood still in the pre-dawn gloom, engines off, hearts sinking. The offensive that was supposed to change Germany's fate had stopped because of something invisible: no fuel. The driver called up from below, panic barely restrained. Herr Obersturmbannführer, the reserve tank's empty too. Peiper slammed his fist against the metal rim, and the sound rang through the fog like a gunshot. I remember the dull echo traveling across the field, bouncing off armor plates and fading into the nothingness that seemed to stretch forever. We had marched for 2 days, carving through the mist of the Ardennes, under orders that promised destiny. Operation Wacht am Rhein. They called it the last great counterattack. The Führer said it would split the Allies in two, recapture Antwerp, and force peace on our terms. But standing there, in the dark, listening to dead engines click as they cooled, I began to sense something no one dared voice. The end might already be written. When dawn came, it was ghostly. Pale light spilled through the haze, revealing a village ahead, Honsfeld, barely a scar on the landscape. Smoke drifted from chimneys of half-collapsed houses. The Americans had fled so fast, they hadn't even doused their campfires. In one corner, a metal cup sat steaming on a barrel, coffee still warm. The scent, mixed with burnt oil, cordite, and the strange sweetness of frozen mud. Then someone shouted. It wasn't panic this time, it was disbelief. Herr Kommandeur, Benzin, Amerikanisches Benzin. I followed Peiper as he walked toward the voice, his long shadow stretching across the frost. There, behind a low ridge, the fog broke to reveal rows upon rows of olive drab containers. Jerry cans, thousands of them stacked like pyramids of metal, glinting under the thin winter sun. They filled an entire field, a sea of fuel waiting in silence, as if the gods themselves had left it for us. Peiper stood there for a long moment, his breath clouding in front of him. His adjutant, Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruber, knelt and pried open one of the cans. He sniffed it, smiled grimly, and muttered, "High octane." The men moved like starving wolves, refueling hoses, pumps, buckets, anything that could drink fuel. The sound of liquid pouring into steel echoed across the clearing, rhythmic and desperate, like the heartbeat of an army that refused to die. As we worked, Peiper paced through the depot counting aloud. 50,000 gallons, enough to push to the Meuse River, enough to reach Antwerp, enough to make victory seem possible again. I watched him pause beside one of the stacks, his gloved hand resting on the metal. His eyes were fixed, not on what we had found, but on what it meant. If the Americans could leave this behind, what did that say about them? The thought struck all of us, quietly at first, like a whisper under the clatter of fuel pumps. No army in history could abandon such quantities unless it could afford to. The realization was heavier than the winter air. While men laughed and cursed in relief, Peiper's expression didn't change. He looked past the jerry cans, toward the gray horizon, where the front lay hidden. His voice, when it came, was low enough that only a few of us heard. "If they can throw this away," he said, "then we have already lost." For the first time, I saw not the warrior, but the man beneath the uniform, a soldier, staring into the arithmetic of impossibility. Around us, the tanks began to roar again as engines drank the stolen gasoline, belching smoke and fire, Yet the smell of victory never came. It was drowned out by the knowledge that we were running a race against an enemy whose abundance defied comprehension. That morning at Honsfeld, we believed we had been blessed by fortune. We didn't yet understand that it was a funeral gift, the last kindness offered to an army already defeated by numbers, by oil, by time itself. The first hours after Honsfeld felt almost like resurrection. Engines roared again, the frost trembled under the vibration of the tanks, and men laughed a sound we hadn't heard in weeks. The Americans had given us a miracle, or so it seemed. 50,000 gallons of gasoline. The smell alone was intoxicating, sweet and sharp, a perfume of victory. But for me, even as I watched the gauges rise, something inside me was wrong. I couldn't stop thinking about what that much fuel meant, and not in the way others did. I'd seen too many miracles turn into graves. The adjutant, Gruber, was beside me, doing the calculations aloud while writing numbers on the side of a truck door. 50,000 gallons, enough for 120 kilometers, maybe 150 if we conserve. The Muse is 65. His tone was triumphant, almost relieved. But I saw Peiper's face as he listened tight, unreadable, as if he were hearing an equation he already knew the outcome of. He didn't answer. He only stared at the horizon where the fog thinned into morning light. It was the same look I'd seen once before back in June 1944, in Berlin, when Albert Speer presented his report to the Führer. I had been in the room that day, one of the aides carrying maps and figures. Speer had spoken calmly, almost gently, about what the Allied bombing had done to our lifeblood, the fuel plants. The Luyuna works, he'd said, produced 175,000 tons in April. In September, 5,000. His voice didn't rise, didn't plead. He just read the numbers, one after another, until silence became unbearable. Hitler dismissed him with a wave, calling it pessimism, but we all knew the truth: Germany was running dry. Now, standing in a captured American depot, the same numbers came back like ghosts. I thought of those hydrogenation plants at Bleckhammer and Brooks, reduced to rubble. Of the U-boats idling in their pens because they couldn't afford to sail. Of pilots who trained for war on 60 hours of flight time because there wasn't enough aviation fuel left to waste on practice. Around us the fog was beginning to clear, revealing a sky so pale it looked hollow. Trucks rolled forward, taking their turn at the pumps. The men joked about coffee, cigarettes, and gasoline like they were the same thing, all rare luxuries from another world. Peiper turned to me suddenly. "Do you know what America produced last year?" His tone was flat, as if testing whether I'd learned the same lesson. I hesitated. "I've read the reports, sir. A great deal." He nodded once. 1.8 billion barrels, we including Romania, and everything we've stolen 33 million. 2%. He said the number, as if it were a confession, not a statistic. I looked at the field again, the endless rows of American cans, the casual waste of a nation that had so much it could afford to forget. I realized something then that no amount of courage or discipline could change. War had become a matter of arithmetic, and arithmetic doesn't bend to faith. In the old wars, courage could still mean something. A bold maneuver, a lucky storm, a commander's will, these things could turn battles. But in 1944, courage without fuel was just death delayed. When the refueling ended, Peiper ordered the column to advance. The tigers growled back to life, treads chewing through the frozen soil, but before climbing into his tank, he paused beside me, speaking softly, almost to himself. "We'll reach the Meuse," he said. "But it won't matter. This isn't a battle between armies anymore. It's a battle between factories." I didn't know then how right he was. That morning the roar of the engines sounded like triumph, but underneath it was just the sound of numbers, temporary, merciless, and already running out. 2 days earlier, before that frozen dawn at Honsfeld, I'd sat in a dim operations room in Tondorf, listening to words that sounded like confidence but smelled like desperation. The long table was littered with maps, fuel charts, and half-smoked cigarettes. The walls sweated from the heat of too many stoves. Outside, the December wind howled like a wolf at the door. General Sepp Dietrich stood at the front, his finger tracing the thick blue arrow across the map, our intended route through the Ardennes. He spoke of timing, shock, and surprise. "You, Peiper," he said, "will be the spearhead. You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies." His voice lingered on that last line, and the pause afterward told us more than any order could. We had been given 31,000 gallons, enough for 50 miles. The Meuse was 65 miles away. The mathematics of failure were written directly into the plan. I remember Peiper's expression then. He didn't protest, didn't even flinch. He just nodded, as if accepting a personal burden that reason had already rejected. Later that night, he told me quietly, "Our war now depends on what we can steal." His tone was neither angry nor bitter, just factual, like a man describing the weather that would kill him. When the offensive began on December 16, 1944, the Ardennes was still half asleep. We moved out at dawn, engines grumbling, exhaust hanging in the air like ghosts. I was riding in the second Tiger, watching the forest crawl past through periscopes slick with ice. We were supposed to reach Lanzerath by midday, but the roads on the maps turned out to be narrow farm lanes, twisting between trees and frozen fields. Within hours, the first bottleneck formed a long metallic serpent of tanks, trucks, and horse-drawn wagons that stretched for miles. The engines idled endlessly, burning precious fuel. I could see the drivers' faces, half hidden behind scarves, their eyes reflecting the blue glow of gauges sinking toward empty. Somewhere ahead, we heard the rattle of machine gun fire. By afternoon, we realized it wasn't a major battle at all, just 18 American scouts holding a ridge, an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. 18 men against thousands. Yet they held us for nearly 10 hours. The arrogance of it would have been infuriating if it weren't so effective. We watched our fuel gauges sink while waiting for them to die. By the time we finally broke through, darkness had already fallen, and we'd used nearly half our supply. Inside the tanks, the heat had long vanished. Men's breath turned to mist. The sound of engines idling became a cruel rhythm. Each pulse of a piston was a gulp of life we couldn't replace. Peiper's voice came over the radio, calm but clipped. "Engines off during all halts exceeding 5 minutes. Every drop counts." We obeyed. The sudden silence after an order like that was haunting. You could hear boots crunching in the snow, the distant pop of rifles, even the creak of frozen branches overhead. We were an army of steel statues, waiting for permission to move or to die. At one halt, I saw Peiper standing on the road, staring down at a puddle of spilled fuel. He crouched, dipped his glove into it, rubbed his fingers together, as if feeling time itself slip away. "This," he said to no one in particular, "is the blood of modern war, and ours is running out." Later that night, I wrote in my field journal, though I never dared sign my name, "We are fighting not the Americans, but their factories. We are fighting against oil wells and assembly lines." By the time we reached Honsfeld the next morning, the column had traveled only 20 miles and consumed nearly 40% of its fuel. The snow along the road was black from exhaust. The men were exhausted too, hollow-eyed, running on discipline alone. When we finally saw the abandoned American depot, none of us understood its meaning. Not yet. We only saw salvation. It took Peiper's silence and what followed to reveal that it was, in truth, our last miracle before the arithmetic of war closed its ledger on us forever. At Honsfeld, the air reeked of gasoline and disbelief. Our men had been refueling for hours, shouting over the roar of engines, slipping on frozen mud slick with spilled fuel. The noise was deafening, tigers coughing back to life, trucks grinding their gears, the wind moaning through the wrecked barns. But amid the chaos, Peiper moved silently, inspecting everything like a man searching for a truth he didn't want to find. It was Sergeant Hoffman who brought him the first clue. The man had worked in his father's import business before the war and spoke English well enough to read the labels on a stack of papers found in the depot's office. They were shipping manifests, pages of neat type listing routes and numbers. 6,000 miles. I watched Peiper take the papers, read them twice, then fold them carefully and slip them into his coat. He didn't say anything, but his hand lingered in the pocket, as if the weight of the documents pressed harder than any shell could. 6 weeks, Hoffman said softly beside me. They moved this fuel 6,000 miles in 6 weeks. Outside, the men were laughing again. One tank commander was boasting that American fuel was too good for our engines, that it burned hotter and made the Maybachs sputter. Someone joked that even the gasoline had more power than we did. It should have been funny. It wasn't. A few meters away, Private Ernst Carr had found a pile of newspapers, the Stars and Stripes, dated December 15th, only 2 days old. He flipped through one and suddenly froze. "Herr Obersturmbannführer," he called out, holding the paper up like a captured flag. The headline read, "New fuel pipeline opened from Cherbourg to Verdun, 300,000 gallons per day." I will never forget Peiper's face when he read that line. He said nothing, but the blood drained from his cheeks. I saw it even through the frost forming on his collar. He crushed the paper slowly in his fist until it tore. Then he threw it into the mud, where it soaked up the same fuel we had just stolen. We all understood. A single American pipeline, one of many, could deliver more fuel in a single day than our entire division would use in an entire campaign. That wasn't strategy. That was a different kind of war. One that couldn't be fought with bravery or skill. I began to notice details I hadn't seen before. The smooth rubber hoses the Americans had used. The perfectly labeled jerry cans. The identical fonts on every crate. Every object here whispered the same truth. Organization born of abundance. The men didn't want to hear it. They were too busy living the illusion of luck. But as the day went on, I could see the doubt spreading like frost over glass. The depot wasn't chaos, it was precision. The Americans had built a system so vast that even their leftovers were beyond our comprehension. Later that afternoon, Peiper called his officers together. We stood around a map laid on the hood of a fuel truck, the edges curling in the wind. He pointed to our position, then to the Meuse, his finger moving along a route lined with hope and futility. "We will move at dusk," he said, "refueled, rearmed, and ready. But remember, every drop we burn must be replaced by what we take. There will be no resupply." Someone asked if Berlin understood how little we had. Peiper's eyes flashed for the briefest moment. "Berlin understands only numbers," he said. "But the Americans understand systems. And systems," he added, almost to himself, "cannot be bombed into obedience." When night came, the sky above Honsfeld glowed faintly from the burning wreckage of the town. The tanks rolled out one by one, engines rumbling like thunder. I looked back once before climbing aboard my vehicle. Rows of empty jerry cans lay scattered behind us, glinting in the moonlight, small, metallic graves marking where we had stolen a few more hours of life. In that eerie half-light, I finally grasped the shape of our enemy. We weren't fighting soldiers anymore. We were fighting an industrial civilization whose heartbeat was measured in gallons, whose veins stretched across oceans. We thought we'd found salvation in their leftovers, but all we had found was proof of their infinity. By the afternoon of December 17th, we were drunk on motion. The engines sang again, and for a few fleeting hours, we felt like warriors rather than fugitives of fate. The column rolled through the narrow roads toward Stavelot, the Tigers leading, their treads shattering the thin crust of ice over puddles. The countryside was half buried in snow, pale smoke rising from deserted farmhouses. The air smelled of gasoline and fear. But before dusk, that smell changed. At first, it was only a shimmer, something on the horizon, like a mirage flickering in the winter haze. Then came the sound, a deep, rolling concussion that made the ground shudder. One of the gunners thought the Americans were shelling us. He climbed up the turret, peered through his binoculars, and whispered, "No, sir, it's fire." The sky to the west had turned the color of molten copper. When we crested the next hill, we saw it clearly, a wall of flame rising 100 feet into the air, twisting in the wind, the smoke, a black pillar stretching toward heaven. The fuel depot at Stavelot, 2 million gallons, was burning. For a long time, no one spoke. The crackle of the flames carried across miles, mingling with the faint pops of exploding jerry cans. The entire horizon was alive, a living inferno, consuming what could have carried us to the Meuse and beyond. We didn't know it then, but it wasn't an accident. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had received his orders just hours before we arrived: deny fuel to the enemy at all costs. His men poured trails of gasoline between the stacks and lit them with white phosphorus grenades. When we reached the outskirts of Stavelot, the heat hit us like the breath of the sun. I remember shielding my face as the tanks halted. The snow was melting in sheets, turning the road to rivers of mud and fire. Peiper stood on his turret, eyes fixed on the blaze. He didn't speak for nearly 5 minutes. Then he climbed down and said quietly, "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons just to spite us. What are we doing here?" No one answered. I watched his breath mingle with the smoke as he turned away. The fire reflected in his eyes, a dull orange glow that looked almost holy. We'd been taught to see the enemy as decadent and weak, but in that moment, it was clear. The Americans were powerful enough to destroy what we would die to protect. That night, the flames didn't fade. They only spread. Across the Ardennes, other fires bloomed at Spa, Trois Ponts, Bullingen. Reports came in through broken radio transmissions: 1.1 million gallons destroyed at Thuin, 2.5 million at Spa. In the first week alone, over 8 million gallons had been deliberately burned. Each time a depot went up, the men grew quieter. There was no point in cheering when every victory tasted like ash. We were advancing through a wasteland built by our enemies' abundance. They could turn wealth into fire, simply to deny us hope. I wrote in my log that evening, "The Americans fight with mathematics, not bullets. They destroy millions to protect the logic of their system. We destroy ourselves to defy it." Around midnight, I stood outside my half-track, the wind carrying embers from miles away. They drifted through the forest like fiery snow, settling on our tanks and melting into the frost. It was beautiful in a terrible way, the quiet majesty of a world burning not from defeat, but from excess. Peiper passed by, his face ghostly in the glow. "Fuel," he muttered, half to himself, "is the soul of this war, and theirs is infinite." I wanted to answer, to tell him that no soul, no matter how infinite, could be invulnerable. But the words never came. The flames at Stavelot were still rising, and I realized we were watching something more than a depot burning. We were watching the last illusion of German victory go up in smoke. By dawn on December 18th, the miracle at Honsfeld had already dissolved into arithmetic. We had burned nearly everything we captured. The tanks that had once seemed immortal were now thirsty monsters again, each mile eating away the last of our hope. The roads had turned into a graveyard of machinery engines, smoking, treads half buried in slush, crews standing silently beside empty fuel drums, as if waiting for mercy that would never come. I rode in the back of a command truck, watching through the canvas flap as the forest slid past black trees against white snow, all of it blurred by exhaustion. Every few kilometers, we passed another abandoned vehicle. Sometimes we'd siphon a few liters from one, sharing it between 3 others. It was like feeding the dying with drops of blood. By noon, the reports were clear. Our column had consumed 67,000 gallons since the offensive began and captured perhaps 55,000. We were running at a deficit. and no one in Berlin could fix arithmetic. Peiper called a meeting at a roadside barn. We gathered around a single lantern on a crate, our faces ghostly in its light. The map spread before us looked more like a post-mortem than a plan. The red line we'd drawn toward the Meuse now seemed laughably long. "We have enough for 20 kilometers," said Sturmbannführer Werner Portka, his voice shaking. "The Meuse is 30. For a long moment, Peiper said nothing. Then he placed both hands on the table, the leather of his gloves creaking. "We are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we've received for the entire offensive." He looked up, eyes dark and hollow. "Gentlemen, we are fighting infinity." No one replied. What could we say to infinity? Outside, the wind howled through the cracks of the barn. I could hear the distant rumble of American bombers overhead, not dropping bombs this time, just crossing the sky in endless convoys toward some other front. Even their engines sounded richer, hungrier, more alive. That afternoon, we learned from intercepted transmissions that the Americans were airlifting fuel to Bastogne, 160,000 gallons in a single day. They were flying more fuel to a surrounded garrison than our entire division possessed. I remember someone laughing bitterly, the sound dry and sharp. "They resupply by air," he said. "We pray by air." The Americans had names for everything: Red Ball Express, Pipeline Under the Ocean, Cherbourg-Paris Line, systems feeding systems, steel veins pulsing with gasoline. They didn't fight battles, they powered them. Their convoys carried 12,000 tons of supplies daily, 6,000 trucks driving day and night. Even their waste was larger than our need. When I tried to sleep that night, I could still hear the engines idling outside, not ours, but theirs, somewhere beyond the trees. A low, endless hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. I thought about something Peiper had said earlier that day. They don't measure war in courage anymore, they measure it in gallons. I wrote that line down in my notebook, though I didn't know why. Perhaps I wanted to remember the moment when I understood that courage had no currency left. At dawn, we moved again. Some of our Tigers had to be towed by half-tracks. Others were left behind entirely. The men didn't curse or complain. They simply walked beside the tanks, rifles slung across their shoulders, boots crunching in the snow. We no longer looked like an armored column. We looked like refugees carrying metal corpses. As we passed through a small Belgian village, a child stepped out from a doorway, watching our procession. She was holding a tin cup, steam rising from it, coffee perhaps. I stared at it for too long, mesmerized by something so ordinary. The smell of fuel clung to my coat. It had become the scent of our defeat. We were soldiers in an army that had once believed in destiny. But destiny, I realized, required resources. And ours were gone. The arithmetic had caught up to us, as it always would. By December 20th, the snow had stopped, but the sky was the color of iron. Our column moved in fragments now, pockets of tanks crawling like wounded animals through the Ardennes. Most of our fuel trucks had been destroyed by Allied aircraft. The rest we'd hidden in barns or ditches, hoping to save a few more hours of motion. But time was eating us alive. That morning, we received a radio message from headquarters. Peiper read it aloud, his voice brittle. "Fuel convoy destroyed. No resupply possible. Continue operations with available resources." He folded the paper slowly and looked around the group of officers. We were standing in the yard of a burned farmhouse, surrounded by hulks of vehicles whose engines had gone silent. "Available resources," he repeated softly, almost laughing. "Perhaps they mean courage." No one answered. We all knew courage couldn't be poured into a tank. The men had stopped asking when fuel would come. They simply walked beside the machines, gloved hands resting on steel that had carried them across half of Europe. Some slept inside their tanks at night to stay warm, their breath frosting the periscope glass. I saw one of them whisper to his vehicle, as if apologizing before abandoning it. When the Americans surrounded us at La Glaise 2 days later, it wasn't through battle but through inevitability. They had fuel. We did not. That was all. Their tanks roared past us like living things, the exhaust curling up into the gray sky. You could feel their confidence in the vibration of the ground. We fired a few shells out of pride more than hope, then silence returned only the creak of frozen metal cooling for the last time. By the evening of December 21st, we had maybe 1,000 gallons left among what remained of our column, enough to move a handful of vehicles, not an army. Peiper gathered us inside a church that had lost its roof. The snow fell through the open beams, melting on our maps. "We hold until ordered otherwise," he said, but everyone could hear the hollow in his voice. Later that night, I walked among the tanks one last time. Their fuel gauges all pointed to empty. I touched the side of a Tiger, its armor still warm from the day's fighting, and felt the vibration of something vast, dying, not just a machine, but a nation's illusion. We had been told that the Americans were soft, that their soldiers needed comfort, that they lacked will. But what I saw in those days shattered every lie we'd been fed. The Americans had so much they could afford waste. They burned fuel to heat coffee, to melt ice from windshields, to destroy depots just so we wouldn't reach them. They threw away food we would have fought to taste. I remember reading one of the captured letters from an American soldier. It was about home, about boredom, about missing a baseball game. He didn't even mention the war. And it struck me then that we had spent years preparing to die for something that, to them, was merely a task. When we were finally overrun, I saw the faces of the men who captured us. They looked neither cruel nor triumphant, just efficient. They had fuel trucks idling behind them, engines humming, headlights glowing in the falling snow, the sound of abundance. That night, huddled in a barn under guard, I realized that Germany hadn't lost because we were outnumbered, but because we were outproduced. The Americans didn't win by fighting harder. They won because they never had to stop moving. War had ceased to be about bravery or genius. It had become a matter of flow, the flow of oil, steel, and willpower measured in tons and gallons. We, who once believed in destiny and blood, had been defeated by arithmetic. I returned to L'Église 40 years later, when the war was nothing more than photographs and rust. The village had changed: bright houses, quiet streets, tourists with cameras. But at the edge of the square, one relic still remained: the Tiger. Our Tiger. The same one we had abandoned that night when the fuel gauge hit zero. It sat there behind a low fence, its armor streaked with rain and time. The turret still pointed toward the road, as if waiting for an order that would never come. Children climbed onto it, laughing, their voices echoing inside the hollow shell. And I stood there, an old man in a borrowed coat, remembering the sound of that last heartbeat of the engine the moment when history itself had stalled. In 1984, during a veterans gathering, I met an American there, Roy Anderson. They said he'd fought with the 30th Infantry Division. We shook hands beside the tank. His grip was firm, his expression kind. "We always wondered why you stopped," he said. "We thought it was some kind of trap." I couldn't help but laugh. "No trap," I told him, "just empty tanks." He looked at me strangely, as if trying to understand. "We had so much," he said quietly. "We never thought about it." That silence between us was heavier than any speech. He had lived in a world of plenty. I had marched through a world of limits. We had fought the same war, but not the same reality. As we stood there, the late sun caught the frozen glass of the fuel gauge inside the Tiger's cabin. The needle was still fixed on zero. I remember touching it through the open hatch, the metal cold and unmoving. It felt less like a machine now and more like a monument to every impossible hope we had carried, to the truth we had refused to see. When I looked back on it, all the fires at Stavelot, the empty convoys, for the columns stranded in snow, it seemed clear that Germany had never been defeated by armies, but by production. America had fought with oceans of fuel, rivers of steel, mountains of food. We had fought with pride and shortage. I think of Peiper's words often: "We are fighting infinity." He was right. Infinity does not surrender. In the end, what we captured at Honsfeld, those 50,000 gallons that once made us cheer, was less than a rounding error in their daily supply. Less than the Red Ball Express burned, just keeping its trucks warm. To us, it was a miracle. To them, it was nothing. When I left L'Église that evening, the sun was setting behind the hills. The tank's shadow stretched long across the cobblestones, the last remnant of a dream built on fumes. Somewhere nearby, a car engine started smooth, effortless, abundant. I closed my eyes for a moment and listened. The sound of fuel. The sound of victory. The sound of everything we never had.